So the first couple of pages deals with how do we find the slopes of parallel and perpendicular lines. If you look at these first three lines on this grid, just by looking at the graph, we can see that they are parallel. Okay? So the relationship is they are parallel. But if we calculated the slope of each line, and remember, there's two ways to calculate slope. One, if you're given the line or line segment on a graph, you can count out rise over run. If you're not given a graph, if you're given just points, that's when you got to use the slope formula. Y2 minus Y1 over X2 minus X1. So because I have a graph, I can find the slope of all three lines, and I've got a couple of points shown on each line. So to get from this point to this point on line 1, I rise +3, and I run +1. So we will see that the slope of line 1 is +3 over +1, which is 3. And if you do that for the slope of L2 and the slope of L3, you will find that they will both work out to 3 as well. So what do we notice about the slopes when we find them? They're all the same. Or they are all, yeah, but they are all the same. So from that, we can draw the conclusion that parallel lines have equal slopes. So if I said to you the slope of one line was 3 over 7, and I asked you to tell me the slope of a parallel line, it's 3 over 7. Okay. So parallel lines have equal slopes. What about lines that are perpendicular to each other? This is a little bit harder to see. But here are two lines that are perpendicular to each other. Remember, what does perpendicular mean? It means they cross each other at 90-degree angles. Okay? They intersect each other at 90-degree angles. So by looking at the graph, we can see that line 1 and L2, they are perpendicular to each other. But this time, if we find the slope of each one, they're not going to be the same. But there is going to be a relationship between the two. So the slope of L1, well, here from this point to this point, I rise +1, and I run +2. And for L2, from this point to this point, I rise -2 because I'm going down, and I run +1. So the slope of L1 will be a rise of +1 over a run of +2. The slope of L2 will be a rise of -2 over a run of 1, or we could just say 2. So this is a little harder to see the relationship between these two, but hopefully you can see that one is the flip of the other. That's one part of it. Okay? So two perpendicular lines, they will have flipped slopes, or the fancy math word, reciprocal. But notice too that it changes signs. So if I'm given the slope of 1, to find the slope of a perpendicular of it, I have to flip it and change the sign. So if I give you a slope of 1/2, you flip it to 2/1, change the sign to negative, and it becomes -2. If I give you, say, a slope of -4/5, flip it to 5/4 and change it to +5/4. So we call that, they are negative reciprocals of each other. Negative means change the sign. Reciprocals means flip it. And therefore, the conclusion that we can draw, perpendicular lines have slopes that are negative reciprocals of each other. Okay. So that's how parallel lines and perpendicular lines are related to slope. So the last thing to do is just answer a couple of questions. And hopefully you will have got the first couple of examples. So in this first one, line GH passes through those 2 points. Line JK passes through those 2 points. MN passes through those 2 points. Are these lines parallel? So to find that, we got to find the slope of each one using the slope formula. So for GH, remember this is x1, y1, this is x2, y2. It would be -1 subtract 2 over 2 subtract -4, which will change to plus. So that becomes -3/6, or -1/2. And then you've got to do JK. Again, second y minus first y is 3 minus 7 over 7 subtract -1, which is going to become plus. And we get -4 over +8, which reduces to -1/2. So what can you tell me about these two lines right now? They're parallel. They have the same slope. Let's see what MN does. 1 minus 5 over 5 minus -4 gives us -4/9, which doesn't reduce. There's no relationship between MN and the previous two lines. Okay, so the best we can say is GH and JK are parallel. For the second example, again, find the slope of each one, compare them. So for PQ, and you should be used to this by now, 10 subtract 2 over -2 subtract -7. That gives us 8/5. And for the slope of RS, we get 1 subtract -4 over 5 subtract -3. And that gives us +5 over +8. While they're definitely not parallel, because they're not the same, are they negative reciprocals of each other? No. They're reciprocals, but not negative ones. So there's no relationship. So we would say neither. And if you sketch these two lines, you would see that that's in fact the case. So negative 7, 2 is P. Negative 2, 10 is Q. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 is Q. So there's line PQ. And R is negative 3, negative 4. S is 5, 1. And we can see that they're definitely not parallel because they don't run in the same direction. They're going to meet. And they're definitely not perpendicular. So all of that you should have been able to get a decent handle on. But I do want to include, oh, sorry, we've got one more here. So for this one, we need to find the slope of EF. So we do negative 1 subtract 3 over negative 4 subtract 2. And we get negative 4 over negative 6, which simplifies to what? Positive 2 over 3. The two negatives become positive and I can reduce it. And then what would be a slope perpendicular? And here's a symbol that you can use for perpendicular instead of having to write the word out all the time. So a perpendicular slope would be, well, what do I got to do to this? Flip it and change the sign. What do I get? Negative 3 over 2. Okay, example 4. First of all, we have to remember some words relating to shapes. And I would suggest you write these down. What's a quadrilateral? Quad. 4. Lateral. If you move laterally, don't you move side to side? 4 sides. It is a 4-sided shape or a 4-sided polygon. There are all sorts of quadrilaterals, and they have certain properties. You should be familiar with rectangles and squares and parallelograms. There are several others as well. There are kites. There are rhombuses. There are trapezoids. But I want to focus on just a couple. A parallelogram is a 4-sided shape. But what's so special about a parallelogram? Can anybody tell me? Opposite sides are parallel. What about a rectangle? Is a rectangle a parallelogram? If you think of a rectangle, are opposite sides parallel? Yes. But plus, what does a rectangle have? Right angles. So we would say a rectangle, opposite sides parallel, and right angles. If it doesn't have right angles, it's a parallelogram. If it does, it's a rectangle. What about a square? Is a square a parallelogram? Opposite sides parallel? Yes. Is a square a rectangle? Really? Remember what a rectangle is? Opposite sides parallel and right angles. Yes. A square is also a rectangle. But a square has one more property. All the sides are equal. Okay? But we're going to focus on these. Now that we know these, we can answer this question. We are told, we are given a graph of ABCD. Okay? We are told that it's a parallelogram. So we know that the opposite sides are parallel. The question is it a rectangle? Well, you probably look at this and say, well, it looks like one, because it looks like these are all right angles. Okay? But you have to justify it, which means you have to back it up with some math. How can we determine, like, let's just look at one of the angles. Because if one of the angles is a right angle, they all have to be. So how could I show that angle B here is a right angle using what we just learned in this lesson? Yes. Find the slope of AB, find the slope of BC, see if they're perpendicular to each other. So let's find the slope of AB. And because we have the graph, we don't have to use the slope formula. You can if you want. You can get the coordinates of A and B and use the slope formula. But why bother when I've got the graph right here? So to get from A to B, how much do I rise, quote unquote? How much do I rise? Remember, rise means up or down. Up or down. Down 4, which means -4. How much do I run? Just 1, plus 1. So it would be -4 over +1. I'm not going to simplify it because I need to compare it with the other one. So if they're perpendicular, if they're right angles, what does CD have to work out to be? If this is -4 over 1, in order to be a right angle, the next one has to work out to what? 1 over 4. So let's see, from B to C. I rise 2, so +2, and I run 8. So the slope of CD, or BC, pardon me, is 2 over 8, which is 1 over 4. But you're not done yet. You need a concluding statement. We would say something to the effect of, because AB is perpendicular, and you can use that shorthand if you want, to BC, B is a right angle because they're perpendicular. And therefore, ABCD is a rectangle. You need a concluding statement. I could basically ask you 2 types of questions with this. I could give you one and say like this, where to say it's it's a parallelogram, prove to me it's a rectangle. Or I could give you one that says it's four-sided shape, prove to me it's a parallelogram. To prove it's a parallelogram, you'd have to find all the slopes. And if the opposite slopes are all equal to each other, then you've proven it's a parallelogram. Okay. Okay. So that's